Hi everyone. It's so nice to be here, see so many old colleagues and friends as well. My name is Zandra Thuvesson. I'm right now home with my 4-month baby, but when Laura asked me to do this talk today, I couldn't say no because it's one of the most interesting theme that I know about. So I'm very happy to be here, and the baby is safe with my boyfriend at home. They're doing the laundry. I have a very prominent panel here with me today. Here I have to my side Jitka Pánek Jurková. You're the director in Brussels at the Czech Centre, and you're also a researcher, and that's why mostly you're here today, Jitka. Welcome.
Thank you.
And by your side we have Emilia Palonen. Welcome as well. You're a researcher and a senior lecturer in political science, both educated in UK and in Finland.
Not really, just UK.
Really, only UK. But now you're based in Helsinki.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Very warm welcome here as well.
Thank you.
And by your side we have Ulrich Fuchs. You're the chair board of the EU capital cities that we're going to talk a little bit about, because we have some really concrete examples of that. But I wanted to ask you to start with 3 minutes talking points on your background and your perspective of the cultural diplomacy and populism. That's the theme for the 45 minutes talk. After that, we have some questions as well. But 45 minutes is not long, so let's start. Please, Jitka.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here too. So, as was said, I am a researcher, at this time the director of Czech Centre in Brussels. My research has been always in culture diplomacy, because this is the topic that has really fascinated me from the very first year of my university studies in political science as well, actually. And as the years passed by, I actually moved from this notion that we still pretty often hear of culture as being the noble and the neutral and the automatically dialogical ground, to a more nuanced understanding of what culture in international relations does. This is what I write about, this is what I lecture about, and this is also how why I went to Brussels, because Brussels is obviously a candy shop for a researcher in culture diplomacy. You see all the approaches, you see populist governments examining culture diplomacy there. You see more democratic, more Eurocentric approaches as well. But what is important for me to always emphasize is that in international relations, culture is instrumentalized. This is not to demonize it, but to understand how important it is to be able to recognize the forces behind every culture diplomacy and every foreign culture policy. To the notion of populism in culture diplomacy, I think it's an excellent topic. I have not been publishing on that. I was recently writing on culture diplomacy of divided societies and how the divisions in societies reflect in the external culture representation. But definitely the notion of populism and culture diplomacy is a very pertinent one. So how do we define populism, and how, for that matter, do we define culture diplomacy? For me, culture diplomacy is a governmentally facilitated practice of communication with foreign audience through what the country considers to be culture. This might differ very broadly, and probably we can discuss it later. But what is populism? The definitions of populism really range from, let's say, pro-democratic way of seeing society, meaning closer to the people, to, let's say, a more contemporary context, which is closer to my understanding of populism as an anti-elitist movement. In this sense, can culture diplomacy be populist? Isn't culture diplomacy necessarily, at least partly, an elitist practice? That really depends on each of us to think about what we consider culture diplomacy, but this is what I always examine. Probably the last remark, I think that populism could reflect on culture diplomacy in multiple ways. It could be the very content of culture diplomacy, even though I don't think that's too often the case. But what I think is more pertinent is that populism and the populistic political environment that we see today is somehow structuring the environment of culture diplomacy. To be very specific, because I think the topic is concrete impacts of populism and culture diplomacy, my last sentence, what I feel in my job as a representative or as the one who conducts Czech culture diplomacy in Brussels is that the very core notion of culture diplomacy, meaning culture, is becoming a little controversial topic, right? It's an elitist notion. It is controversial. People don't like to hear too much about art being sponsored by state money somewhere in the evil Brussels that is very distant to them. From my perspective, populism is structuring the environment into which culture diplomacy enters nowadays.
Wow, thank you, Jitka. It's challenging for the moderator not to interrupt and ask 10 questions during your talking points. But let's get back to the questions. Sure. Thank you. Emilia, your 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm not really an expert in cultural diplomacy. I have been working as a lecturer in cultural policy, however, and I have studied polarized societies, particularly Hungarian politics during the first Orbán government's period and after. And I have witnessed transformations of cityscapes and street names and memorials and architecture and museum policies and all kinds of things there. And then recently I have been writing about, for instance, the Guggenheim Museum plans in Helsinki as a case of cultural populism. And the way in which these kind of debates about culture tend to polarize even among the elites. And they polarize in a way that it generates very strong us's and them's, and you have very little possibility of actually overcoming that political frontier between them. There's this volume called Populism on the Loose that's open access, and that's where you can find this article about Helsinki. I'm an academic, as you can hear, and of course, in my early postdoc years, already more than 10 years ago, I studied European capitals of culture, because this Hungarian case with all the polarization and post-communism and nationalism, etc., was really kind of depressing for me. So I thought, let's take a very nice and uplifting theme for the postdoc study, and let's study European capitals of culture. And I don't know, maybe you might talk about other less uplifting things about them as well. But for me, this was very interesting, and I took part even as with the international group doing urban interventions in Sibiu and Luxembourg in 2007, when they were European capitals of culture. And I have studied problems of multi-level governance in terms of European capitals of culture, where, for instance, with the case of Vilnius, you would see that transformation on a national level of politics might actually have a huge impact on what is considered as a European cultural policy instrument. And then that leads to questions about funding, etc. It's also an article that I've written about that, Nordic cultural policy research journal. These kinds of questions have been important to me. And now I'm studying actually populism. And I've been complaining about the way in which populism gets understood as nationalism and racism and xenophobia. And I've been very worried about our abilities to talk about xenophobia, misogyny, racism, etc., if we reduce that to populism, because populism is always Janus-faced. It always has both a democratic and an anti-democratic side, and it depends on how does it get articulated, how does the us get articulated and sedimented, and these kind of questions we are looking at currently in this mainstreaming populism consortium at University of Helsinki, where I'm based.
Thank you so much. Let's get back to that question later on as well. And I just want to say as well, the next panel is about media and populism that Henrik Selin here is going to moderate. And we had talked before just to separate the two themes so that we really we'll try to narrow down to the cultural policy situation, and then, but of course, it's connected to the media situation as well regarding populism and so on.
No, but it's also like in these kinds of settings where I find it problematic. If we suddenly, when we talk about populism, actually we talk about we call it populism, but we should be talking about racism and nationalism, yes, and xenophobia, and then we say this is spreading, and there are quite worrying examples of that beyond media.
Yes, thank you, Ulrich. Please.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also coming from the academic field, but I left university 15 years ago. And since then, I'm working in this European project of European Capital of Culture. I was, in fact, program director of 2 European Capitals of Culture in Linz, in Austria in 2009, and then later in Marseille-Provence 2013. And after these 2 experiences of programming such huge and difficult projects, I joined the selection panel of the European Commission since 5 years now, a panel of 10 European experts who select and monitor European capitals of culture. This is work always done 5 years before such an event takes place. So we are now working on 2023, of course. I've been to Umeå in 2014, and I know all the projects of European Capital of Culture in the last years. I have more questions than answers to this topic. And one of the questions I would like to discuss also with the public is, what shall we do for 2023? It's a nightmare year. It will be a nightmare year for European Capital of Culture, because the 2 countries who can propose European Capital of Culture are UK and Hungary. So the experience, I was chairing the panel for this, I'm chairing the panel for this year. UK is a long story, which I cut short because it's a story of an old couple married since 40 years and being in divorce and not be able to communicate anymore. That was happening between the European Commission and the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in London, where we tried to bring them together and to find a solution for this year 23, and we failed. So there will be no European Capital of Culture in UK in 23, although the 5 cities who were preparing and bidding very European, developed a very European bid book and were prepared to have this in 23. The other nightmare is Hungary, and there we are still in this process. So we had a pre-selection meeting in February of this year with 8 Hungarian cities, and studying the bid books, I was really very much surprised to see how that what we call populism, but what I also would call a sort of preparing neo-fascism, has entered the cultural field, where in the understanding of European values, we have quite different points of view, and I could not really share that what was written down in the bid book, so we could not really share that. There was an only city who was about to be prepared, and we knew that this city was consulted by consultants from Germany. So that bid book was, as paper is always, you can write on paper what you want. That was a fake, more or less. Now nevertheless, we pre-selected 3 Hungarian cities for a final selection, which will take place on the 14th of December. So follow the news then from Budapest. And we have...
And you still not have decided?
We have not decided. It's we will have city visits from the 10th, 11th and 12th of December to these 3 pre-selected cities. And then the panel has to decide. And there are 2 possibilities. Either we select one of the cities as European Capital of Culture for 23, or we do not select any city in Hungary, because there is a red line. I spoke to Stuart before this meeting, and he said, well, in any case, whatever you will do, Orban will be a winner. Either he wins because we selected one of the cities, or he will be playing the role of a victim by the European Union. So my question is, what shall we do?
Thank you, Ulrich. And I think we should start off right there, because I have a script, of course, but you always leave the script during a panel. So please tell us, this is, like Jitka said, cultural diplomacy for the most time is governmental structures. And Hungary right now, has a, since 2011 or so, 2010, has this situation, and now you're dealing with this. How
to underline it, it's a country where universities are closed because they are funded by George Soros. That's a country where homeless people are put in prison. That's a country where NGOs who work with refugees are criminalized. Is it possible to develop a European capital of culture, which is an extremely political project? It makes a difference if you organize an artistic festival with artists from some countries, even from Brazil or so. The artists are not belonging to the new and future Brazilian government, which is also a sort of populist or worse movement. But in such a year, it's a governance which is money from the government, it's a mayor who decides a lot of questions. And I'm preparing already some questions. When I read, for example, in an interview that Orban says, I do not want that Hungary becomes the Marseille of Europe, there's a thinking behind. I'm citizen of Marseille. I'm French and German at the same time, and I love the city where I live. It's a very cosmopolitan city. It's much older than Budapest and has a long history of immigration, which works very well. There are a lot of problems in Marseille, but immigration is not a problem.
Oh, it symbolizes everything that he opposes.
And in such a country, is it possible to have a European capital of culture?
Let's
based
ask
on
the
European
panel
values?
first. Emilia and Jitka, what do you say? We have some people here working in some totalitarian countries, and I would ask if you are able to give some talking points on this question if you want to. You know who you are, but first.
Just a brief remark on Hungary, which I think is pretty reflective or representative. Their culture institutes last year got included under the embassy, so they kind of lost their independence, became integral part of the embassies, and at the same time their budget was raised substantially.
So first of all, this is an etatist party. It has been already from the early 2000s. It believes in the state's role in directing culture. So, I mean, this is what people voted in power. So they kind of knew it. We have to respect that. But then the question is, of course, whether we should respect it in a way that we would be giving it that title. The other point about that title, of course, is that it's not that much money from the European Union. And I pointed out these problems already in the beginning of 2010s, that there is no control of the European brand in the European Capitals of Culture programs after they have been sort of selected, and then the money that would be coming out either from the city, state, or from private companies, and these would be all kind of branding themselves through this competition. Right. So if you want to be branding Europe, and you have to be, you want to be certain that Europe is being branded in the way that Europe wants to be branded, then you shouldn't be giving it to Hungary. I mean, from that perspective. There are also other worries in Hungary, and of course, like the closing down of gender studies at universities, and different ways in which the artistic and intellectual space has been shrinking in Hungary. I mean, you should make, if you were to oppose this, you would have to make a whole list of things, and it would be relatively easy to do that list.
I'm aware of this.
So I would recommend not to give the title if you want to be branding Europe in a particular way. This is academic advice. And also, what would happen is that this would be used, as you said, by the government as a talking point against Europe and how they're being treated poorly and not understood, and the value of Hungarian culture. That, I mean, if you're now saying that European culture is not, it wouldn't be properly displayed, that it would be all about Hungary or something. So then they would be saying, well, Hungarian culture is like the best in the world, and you should be, of course, respecting that. And haven't we got all these examples of the wonderful Hungarian culture, and we wanted to display this. So then you can, of course, say that you can have a Hungarian capital of culture, and that, like, you can do that, but the European capital of culture year could be like postponed, and that year they would be known or something. Yeah.
Without UK, without.
Or then you could say that any city who wants to be a self-declared capital of European capital of culture could do that on kind of a bottom-up approach to this, which is a very kind of elitist top-down, like selection and all that. I mean, you could try to do something alternative, something that the people would see actually fit, and what I have been hoping to see more in these European capitals of culture, which is why I got really interested in them, is that it is potentially a really wonderful bottom-up possibility of articulating your vision of Europe, and this is the artistic
like happened in
project
both Marseille and Glasgow, for example.
Yeah.
But can I just one comment? The question is more general. The question is, where are the red lines of Europe against populism?
Yeah, Jitka, maybe you can.
That's more general. That's Hungary is only one case. You could also say reduce the money for Poland, because they do not respect the separation of three powers: government, justice, and parliament. Or against Italy. Now, what about the budget and the budget question in Italy? Where are the red lines for Europe to say no?
Now we have a situation in the EU where we have the paragraph 7, where the EU has finally marked against Hungary. This should have happened 10 years ago.
Yes, but it will not bring any result, because as it's based on the fact that every of the 27 member states have to agree on this Article 7, that will not be the case, neither in Poland, neither against Poland nor against Hungary, because Orban will oppose a decision on Poland, and Kaczynski will oppose a decision on Hungary. So there's no way out. Article 7 is a lame duck.
In 2 sentences, what is Article 7?
Article 7 would be the possibility of the European Union to say you took political decisions which are not according to the European values. That's why you will be punished in a way, by money, by being excluded from the European Council and so on. That's the famous Article 7, which is now on the way against Hungary and Poland because of their political decisions, but which is, as I said, more or less a lame duck, would take years. And if it finally comes to a vote in the European Council, then it has to be an unanimous vote, which will never take place.
I want to let in Jitka, please.
Thanks. The situation of Hungary, and I really don't want to be talking only about Hungary today, but it's, I think, particularly complicated because it's within the EU, but at the same time we are right now talking about Hungary as about an external kind of player. So I'm, for instance, not a big fan, I'm not a fan at all of culture boycotts. For instance, during the Cold War, culture diplomacy between the US and the Soviet Union was a very good tool how to test mutual communication, just like to actually be testing the red lines or whatever there was with even seeing, for instance, the media attention paid to each of the exhibitions or the exchange of the orchestras, and thus saying what is actually the narrative of the second country. For instance, in the 50s, the exhibition of American abstract art in Moscow really helped to decrease the demonization of the second side. So in general, I would not say yes to a boycott, but with Hungary, we obviously are facing the fact that they are kind of part of the group, and even just the title, the European Capital of Culture, could be hardly attributed to someone who is going against the values that we perceive as fundamental. So I think it's a difficult case because it really is a double-sided.
Yeah, if we should step forward and not only talking about Hungary, I think we have some questions for the audience regarding Hungary and your straightforward question, Ulrich. But in what ways can cultural diplomacy support artists to work independent in this context and in other situations as well? We have Spain moving towards some very harsh situations. The media are being attacked by the interior affairs and taking their sources and so on.
Well, cultural diplomacy can even encourage artists who are in opposition in their countries to populist movements to be visible on the international stage. So, for example, this case, which is a real case, that one of the directors of a project in Marseille, which is a big circus festival taking place every 2 years, he recently asked me, and he said, there are so many Brazilian artists who are very concerned now about the situation in their country, what you all know. And of course, I told him, or I advised him to say, well, there's no reason at all not to invite Brazilian artists to do. You do not want to punish an artistic or cultural scene in a country which lives under totalitarian system. The opposite is true. You have to encourage artists to be recognized in artistic festivals. But these are artistic festivals. Of course, we from my point of view, nothing to say against that Israeli artists are present in the festival of Avignon or wherever, because they are not representing the Israeli government, which you can criticize, but they are representing either themselves or cultural stakeholders in their country. So I think you can make a clear difference between encouraging and supporting artists from wherever, when they have a good quality as artists and cultural stakeholders. But there is also something linked, culture and government has something to do with each other. For example, in Marseille, we had a clear decision that that was due to the effect that Marseille-Provence was a Euro-Mediterranean project. So we had a lot of artists from Arab countries, and we had a clear decision that we would not rely on artistic groups financed by the Israeli government. That would have caused huge problems because all the Arab artists would have withdrawn their presence in these projects, and the Israeli government is doing a bit the same thing, for example, that the Hungarian government, that they are investing in culture in order to to make their policy worldwide recognized.
I actually have to disagree there. I made some research on that, and the Israel investment into culture is actually decreasing, and it has never been too huge. It was huge in the field of public diplomacy, like information campaigns, but arts just have never been a large part of the narrative, at least according to the research I have done. But if I can react to your question, I actually think it's a condition sine qua non that the artists are free in their expression if employed in culture diplomacy. If that's not the case, we are really talking about propaganda or making the narrative much more narrow than it would naturally be. And I think it actually really boils always to the issue of the artist considering if he is comfortable enough to be part of the external policy of the state. An interesting example so in this case we are talking about, a synergy between the agenda of the artist and of the state, which I think is the ideal way. An interesting example have been the black Afro-American artists in the 1950s traveling the world with the support of the US government. And the good research has been done on that by Danielle Fossel-Lucier in her book Music and America's Culture Diplomacy. And she has actually researched the feelings of these Afro-American artists still at the time of the segregation representing USA abroad, and what they would usually suggest was that they considered furthering their agency important enough to go for it. To go for it, they thought it was important to speak on the behalf of the Black community in the USA abroad, and also to somehow become recognized internally, domestically in the USA, recognized national symbols. So for them, the pros and cons were very consciously deliberated, and they decided to be part of the official representation of the regime that was treating them unfairly at that time, because from the long term they thought it would be beneficial. And it actually was efficient in this way, because the domestic audience in the USA did start to perceive the African Americans artists as its own representatives.
And has your research, thank you very much for giving this historical perspective. Have your research today pointed out that we see the same situation today? Have you done research on that?
In which sense exactly?
I mean that we should let artists represent the country when they're free of speech and so on in different areas.
Sure, absolutely, but we should still consider that not in every country the same values of permanent self-reflection and self-criticism and questioning the state authority are actually in place. For instance, the major chapter is Chinese diplomacy nowadays, and seriously, I mean, from what I have seen, the Chinese academicians and Chinese artists don't question the authority of the state. It's just not part of their mental universe. I don't say in 100%, but in 95%. Whereas in Europe, it would be, I guess, exactly the other way around. Critical agency is not part of how they perceive themselves.
But
please, Emilia. Yes.
Obviously, we should also recognize critical agency towards the European Union. And often when we talk about in terms of like we and whatever, it would be really important to know what this we is. But I think this was a really good suggestion that we would have more interaction between and invite artists, but also I would suggest that one should do not just state level, but like middle level and grassroots level interaction and collaboration. Now you can do it over the internet. You can start building on these networks. That would be then inclusive for those people who find their own national space being shrunken, whether it's in terms of arts or academic.
So in your point of view, the best invested, if you can say that, money for cultural diplomacy regarding countries that are oppressed by the government in cultural policy structures is to put money in a way more underground, internet-based structures?
Not necessarily underground. Underground is one way, and also kind of bottom up. But these middle-level organizations and connections between cities, connections between counties or other sort of institutions. So instead of state funding directly these kinds of linkages and residencies, etc., they could be funding institutions that would be then generating like long-term connections to institutions in those countries and through or even independent groups when the institutions have already been taken over by the ruling ideology.
Yes. But Jitka, what would you say about this as well?
I don't know enough. The research that you focus on these different levels is not the approach I'm taking. I'm usually focused.
But you're from Czech, and the best practice. What would you say? You're working in Brussels. You're having problems in Brussels talking back towards your country because they don't understand really what you do. We talked about the Roma question. That's the easiest question for you to work with because it's so narrowed down. But please tell us what you told me about the general situation.
We have discussed this issue this morning and yesterday evening here in this room already. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable representing my country abroad in a way that is not true to whatever is happening domestically. So, for instance, even though in Brussels, obviously, the topic of minorities and treating minorities is a very popular one, I wouldn't feel, confident enough to present us as the best practice. So, in this sense, I do put emphasis on things that are actually the best practice in the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Some amazing examples of culture management, scientific diplomacy, which I consider to be a very important part of public diplomacy in general as well. And obviously, I mean, again, if we really boiled it down to providing space for encounters, and I'm not saying this is a neutral practice, it's not neutral at all, but it always has a value in itself. So this I think is always something that should be made part of a good practice, just to provide space for people to meet.
Right now we have 3 academic talking with me as a bureaucrat, I would say for myself. What do we miss out the artistic perspective?
I was really happy that the artists joined us in the previous panels, because I think they are very instrumental in somehow probably making us a little bit less self-confident in our words and choices.
Do we have some questions for the audience, and maybe for the straightforward Ulrich question here as well? What should we do about Hungary 2023? We have one there.
Why do you have so high expectation of this title for cultural Europe, cultural city of Europe? Why do you expect that a city will take over and explain what are the European values when we have the European values on the agenda every day, but it is still a concept? It is not common values in every member state. So take Stockholm, when it became first time cultural city of Europe, capital of Europe. It was a marketing process. It marketed Stockholm. It put Stockholm on the agenda of Europe. We could have here all kinds of folkloric dancers from everywhere and so on from Europe. It was an eye opener for us, but I did not see that it brought on the table the European values that you are talking about.
You agree that this is 30 years ago?
It was 98.
Yeah,
the
more
first
than
time.
30 years ago.
Well,
time has changed since?
Yes, but I find it difficult still to expect that artists only will be those ambassadors for cultural diplomacy. We have diplomats also.
It's not. You have excuse me, but you have a rather not updated understanding of that. What's the European
I'm not that
capital
old.
of culture?
I keep updating.
No. But European capitals of culture today, if the project is a success, and there have been successes, less good successes, even bad examples, as in every entrepreneurship, by the way. European capital of culture, which are really state of the art, they show the diversity of European culture, which is a high value, which I would defend. That means they show that was the artists and cultural stakeholders in the city and the country can contribute to European culture, and they open the doors and windows to let artists and cultural stakeholders from other European capitals, even from the international scene, inwards. And that can extremely increase the cultural understanding based on our values, that is openness, learning from each other, not sticking to the own culture, and not only seeing it as a marketing tool, but a real exchange. And that's why I defend this project with very few money from the European budget. It's only 1.5 million, and in Marseille we had a budget of 91 million. So it's a self-financed scholarship, more or less. But with a self-financed scholarship, you can increase a lot of competences of international understanding if you succeed. And that's why I think it's one of the projects, the few projects of European culture policy which has a certain value.
Thank you for your question. I think I have to let in another question. Thank you. If we have one there as well, in the front.
I remember times of crisis, when there was an attempt to nominate Sarajevo as a European cultural capital. That was during the siege. So it's an example of a big discussion about European values and facing the paralysis of Europe, facing the Yugoslavian war. I also remember Wrocław, which was a European capital of culture with San Sebastian. And from what I understood, at that time, peace was already in power. And Wrocław introduced itself as the city of other Poland. So it was like a resistant city, and wouldn't be possible to find the same situation in Hungary.
Thank you for the good question.
I agree completely with you. The mayor of Wrocław is a strong opposition mayor to Peace Party. Mr. Dudkiewicz is a real European, and he made a wonderful work as a mayor, but the team as well, because they showed another Poland. That was very good, extremely good. This is not the case in Hungary, but all the three cities are strongly committed to Orban, all. And just to your first remark, which is very important as well, fortunately, the European Commission continues also to develop this project, because since 2021, or from 2021 on, there is an open door for cities from non-member state countries. So in 2021, for example, Novi Sad were one of the European capitals of culture, because Serbia is a candidate country. And cities from Bosnia-Herzegovina are now applying for 24, Banja Luka, Mostar, Srebrenica, and a fourth one, which I forgot. So these are improvements, I would say, in the understanding of such a project, to open it for non-EU member countries. And that's also a hope after Brexit. UK can apply as a non-EU member state again.
Yeah. Thank you. Emilia, do you...
Really briefly?
Yeah, we have like 1 minute.
Even if you would have like this oppositional city, then you never know if the powers would be changing in that city.
Yeah. Jitka, do you have some last remarks? Do you have one more question?
Hi,
yes,
my name is Marie. A very short question actually about audiences, what we call audiences in our jargon, as in people, actually. And going back to Jitka's point at the beginning, who is cultural diplomacy for? And who are we engaging? Who are we talking about? Who are we talking to? And actually, can we really tackle populism if we are constantly preaching the converted? It's a bit of a provocative question.
Good question.
But who is the audience of cultural diplomacy? Who are the audience and the diversity within the audience of European Capital of Culture, for example? So how can we think a bit outside the box in that?
Can I react to that? That's a really good question. I've actually been doing research mostly on audience in the last years, because I did feel that in the research of cultural diplomacy this is lacking. We are mostly researching the policies, which is part of the picture, but we rarely research audience. So I started with that 3-4 years ago. I mean, to make a very brief point, in my opinion, cultural diplomacy should be always about the audience. So for me as a practitioner, I am first thinking about the audience, whom I want to talk about. And second part of the issue, if I actually want to be successful in working with the audience, I have to know him and I have to work with him over an extended period of time. So that's also what I do as a practitioner, that I choose my audience and I choose a plan for 2 or 3 years to actually be able to, encounter with the audience in a meaningful way. But the first thing is that you have to know who are you actually talking to, because pretty often the preconceptions are just like leading your message in a ways that you would have never expected when you were kind of planning or forming the program. So it's really important to have this in mind too.
Last remark from Emilia.
I think this was a very good question, and I think cultural diplomacy and European capitals of culture and all these kind of projects would be a very good tool for actually letting people communicate between countries and raise sort of similar concerns that are within those experienced within those countries, which are then now leading to this so-called populism, which is not about racism, which is not about xenophobia, but it's about the real worry between like a possibility of trusting your own future and what kind of a future you would have, what are the sort of shrinking services, even shrinking cultural services around you, and then through this cultural diplomacy you would find ways in which these voices could sort of coincide and find expression, so you wouldn't be any more suspicious of the other countries getting more power or money or something from the European Union, but actually you would enable common thinking of these common problems that all these countries are facing. It's not just their national problems, so overcoming nationalism in that sense.
I think we can wrap up this 55 minutes, not 45, sorry for that, because we started a bit late as well, with more questions than we started with. So that's a bit frustrating, of course, for all of us in this room, I can imagine. But thank you very much for giving us the thoughts. Ulrich, Emilia and Jitka. Thank you. Thank you.